in part because we are so technologically powerful that we cannot possibly survive in the primitive ethical condition that still obtains. That our scientific and descriptive capacity has expanded immensely over the last 400 years to the point where we're a planetary force of creation and destruction. But our ethical endeavor has, to say the least, languished. And you might observe that children given dangerous tools die. And so we have these dangerous tools, and that means, as far as I can tell, that we better become the people that can wield them with wisdom. And that's going to mean, like it's always meant, a return to the source, right? A willingness to rescue the dead father from the belly of the beast, right? A willingness to make conscious the nature of our hierarchy of perceptual priority, let's say, and to understand that that's a reality that might be superordinate to what we normally and have been taught to view as reality itself. And that the biblical notion that in some sense the Word is the precursor to being itself actually turns out to be true. And it's a terrifying idea because it means in some real sense, and I also believe this to be the case, and I think it's also reflective of the deep notion of the Logos, what that means is that in some cosmic sense, it's on you. And you know, we have this notion that human beings, men and women alike, are formulated in the image of God, in the image of the Logos. And we believe that. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's an axiom of our laws. It's an axiom of our constitutional system, certainly in a country like Britain or America, any of the Western democracies, and to a large degree, any country that can function at all. There's the presumption that each person is a locus of divine value. And you think, well, do you want to live in a society that assumes that? Or do you want to live in a society that doesn't? And then you might also ask, do you want to have friends that assume that of you? Or do you want to have friends that don't? And the same thing might apply to the people that you love in your actions towards them. How are you treating them if you treat them properly? And I can't see, even speaking merely psychologically, that you can love someone and not treat them in some most fundamental sense like they're a divine locus of value. I think those are the same thing. And you can quibble about the linguistic representation necessary to derive that conclusion, but have it your way. You're going to act out your decisions one way or another. You're going to learn in the world just exactly what attitude you should bring to bear if you want to elevate those around you and simultaneously do the same to yourself. And you will find that if you do that, to the degree you do that, you are treating each person as if they're a divine locus of value and responsibility. And that's a terrifying thing too, because I read something once, I don't remember who said it, that God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. And I read commentaries on that idea indirectly, obliquely, by Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn, Jung as well, perhaps above all else, stating that we are each a center of the world. We each have a cosmic role to play. And you can think about it this way, and this is a useful way to think about it. You have potential within you to match the potential that's without, let's say. And we all upbraid ourselves and call ourselves out on our failure to manifest that which is within us. And so here's a proposition for you. The world is languishing to the degree that you are not all you could be. And that could really be the truth. And to the degree that we're made in the image of God and made in the image of Logos, and also the entity that has to undergo the tragic death that's represented by Christ, and maybe the encounter with hell that's part of the story of the resurrection. That's us. That's what we face. And so I'll conclude my discussion of the characterization of the spirit that occupies the pinnacle of the hierarchy of attentional priority with the story of the Passion, which is the full embracing of the catastrophe of life. That's what it calls us to. And religious or not, one thing you might notice is that a good proportion of the entire planet has been obsessed with the figure of the crucifixion and the story of the Passion for 2,000 years. And even as an unbeliever, whatever that means, you have to take that seriously. Now you can write it off as a delusion. Freud tried to do that, and so did Marx. But you have to ask yourself, well, if it's a delusion, why didn't people pick just something happy to look at instead of something utterly dreadful? And I say utterly dreadful because, and this is the truth as far as I can tell, what the Passion is a distillation of tragedy. So imagine that in order to contend with your life, you have to be willing to embrace its darkest elements. You might say, why? And I'd say, well, the darkest elements are there and they're coming. And if you're not prepared, it's going to be far worse than it has to be, at minimum. And maybe it'll just lead to your destruction in ways that are worse than death. And that's a high probability. And so in order to live fully, you have to confront life fully. And that means you have to accept the unjust sacrifice of the innocent in some real sense. And that's you. And that's not even enough. You see, in the Christian Passion, why is it the ultimate tragedy? Well, tragedy is undeserved catastrophe, let's say. Well, then you amplify the catastrophe. Youthful death, torturous death, death with foreknowledge, humiliating death, death at the hands of the mob, death as a consequence of betrayal, death in the purview of your mother's vision, death despite your innocence, death despite your moral virtue, death despite the moral virtue that you have that everyone knows about and recognizes and still sentences you to death. Death at the hand of a tyrant, death at the hand of a nihilist. And then that's not enough, because in the cloud of myth that surrounds the characterization of the embodied Logos, and that's Christ, following the radical acceptance of death is the radical confrontation with hell. And that's the harrowing of hell. And the story there says, in order to open yourself up maximally to the possibilities of life, not only do you have to contend with the tragedy of your own innocent sacrifice and be on board with that fully or pay the price, but you have to confront the gates of hell itself. And you might say, well, what does that mean? And you know, our culture has been obsessed in principle since the end of the Second World War with what happened in Nazi Germany. And that's as good an example of hell as anything that could be presented to the corpus of unbelievers who disavow any recognition of hell. And if what happened in the Nazi death camps isn't enough hell for you, then I would suggest that you update your prioritization of perception and value, because it's certainly enough hell to be convincing if you look at it thoroughly. You know, one of the things I tried to do when I studied the Holocaust and also the events in the Gulag was to put myself in the position not of the victim, and certainly not of the heroic rescuer, but of the perpetrator. And with a bit of meditation, you can discover pretty damn rapidly that you could be a perfectly effective, torturing Auschwitz camp guard. And that's a hell of a thing to contend with. And I would say, in some real sense, that's worse than contending with death. And I would also say that if you don't do it, you cannot stop it. If you're unwilling to see the part of you, and that's a Luciferian part in the most fundamental sense, if you're unwilling to face that, to the degree that you're unwilling to face that, that's the spirit that possesses you. And in a world like our world, that is not something that we can continue to do and get away with it. So, we're all called together here at Ephesus, which is quite remarkable for us all to be here. And what are we called to do? Wake up. We have a moral burden to bear. And that's the adventure of our life. That's the other thing so interesting about the Abrahamic story, is that God calls Abraham out of his luxurious slumber and sends him into a catastrophe. Tyranny, starvation, war, brutal. But he has the adventure of his life. You might say, well, it's the adventure of your life that justifies the catastrophe of your life. It's not some simple-minded, juvenile hedonism or desire for comfort. That's not what we're built for. We're built for the adventure of our lives. And where do you find that? You find that in orienting yourself to the highest possible good in all ways and speaking the truth forthrightly along that pathway. Thank you very much.